The legend of King Arthur has captivated the world for over 1,000 years. But how much of it is real? We're going back to the primary sources, the oldest records, the contested chronicles, to find out what history actually says.
He is writing from the edge of a world that has already ended. The cities are empty. The roads still run, but no one maintains them. The villas are ruins. The legions left a century ago and did not return. His name is Gildas. He is a monk or a cleric or something between the two. The record is not precise on this point. He is writing in Latin. That matters. Latin is no longer the language of daily life in Britain. It is the language of the church, of the educated, of those who still believe the structures of the old world carry meaning. He is writing, as best the record can establish, sometime around the year 540. Britain has been without Roman administration for roughly a century. What replaced it is contested. What the record shows is fragmented, partial, and written by people with purposes other than neutral documentation. Gildas is not writing a history. He is writing a sermon. He is writing a denunciation. He is writing to condemn the rulers of his time for their sins and their failures. His text is called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain. It is the closest thing to a contemporary account of 5th and 6th century Britain that survives. He describes the Saxon invasions. He describes the devastation of the island. He describes the resistance. He names the leader who turned the tide. That name is not Arthur. The name Gildas records is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a man of Roman descent, Gildas says, a man whose parents had worn the purple, a man under whose leadership the Britons rallied and fought back. Gildas describes the battle that became the high point of that resistance, a siege or a battle at a place called Badon Hill. The Britons won. The Saxons were pushed back. For a generation, the raids slowed. Gildas does not date the battle with precision. He does not name the commander. He does not describe the tactics or the size of the forces involved. He does not name Arthur. In a text of this length, covering this period, written by someone with direct knowledge of what the British Church remembered about these events, Arthur does not appear. Not in passing. Not as a footnote. Not as a minor figure. Not at all. That absence is where this episode begins. It is worth being precise about what we mean by evidence in a case like this. The question of Arthur is not a legal question. There is no trial record. There is no inquest. There is no body of administrative documentation of the kind that anchors the crime cases this archive examines. What exists is a literary and documentary record. That record can be examined with the same discipline applied to any other evidence base. Who wrote it? When they wrote it? What access they had to earlier materials? What they were trying to do? What purpose the writing served? When those questions are applied to the sources around Arthur, something becomes clear. The earliest sources, the ones written closest to the period when Arthur is said to have lived, do not mention him. The sources that do mention him are written later, some much later, some by people working from earlier sources that have not survived, some by people with clear political purposes, some by people whose relationship to the events they describe is no closer than a novelist's. The gap between what the earliest record contains and what the legend became is not a small gap. It is not a matter of disputed detail or missing context. It is a gap measured in centuries. This episode will trace that gap. Not to argue that Arthur did not exist. The record cannot establish that. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not being precise about what the sources can and cannot do. What the record can establish is something more useful and more interesting. It can establish when each element of the Arthurian legend first appears in writing. It can establish what source introduced it. It can establish whether any earlier source supports it. And it can establish precisely how a silence in a 6th century sermon became the most elaborated legend in the English-speaking world. The silence is where we start. The rest is what people built inside it. To understand what the silence in Gildas means, it is necessary to understand what Britain looked like in the period Gildas was writing about. The Roman administration of Britain ended in or around 410. The date is approximate. What the record shows is that in that year, the Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain. The letter, as it has been transmitted, told them to look to their own defense. The legions did not return. What followed is the period historians call Sub-Roman Britain. It is one of the most poorly documented periods in British history. The administrative apparatus that had generated records, tax registers, legal proceedings, official correspondence, collapsed with the Roman presence. What survives is fragmentary, late, and often written by people who were themselves working from incomplete information. The Saxon incursions into Britain are documented, in the sense that later sources describe them, and that the archaeological record shows population disruption and settlement change consistent with large-scale migration and conflict. The exact chronology, the precise geography, the named individuals who led the resistance. These are where the record becomes thin. Gildas is the exception. He is writing within living memory of some of these events, or close to it. His account is partisan. He is condemning the Britons for their sins, not composing a neutral chronicle. But his text is the closest the record gets to a contemporary witness. He names Ambrosius Aurelianus. The name itself carries information. Ambrosius is a Roman name. Aurelianus is a family name associated with the imperial house. Gildas says his parents had worn the purple. Whether this means they were of imperial descent in some formal sense, or whether Gildas is using the phrase more loosely, cannot be established from his text alone. What is established is this. Gildas knows Ambrosius. He names him. He credits him with the British recovery. He describes the Battle of Badon Hill as the decisive moment of that recovery. Arthur is not in this account. The next significant source is the Historia Brittonum, the history of the Britons. This text is attributed to a writer called Nennius. The attribution is uncertain. The text itself survives in multiple manuscript versions, not all of which agree with each other. The date of composition is placed by scholars at around 830, roughly 3 centuries after the period it describes. The Historia Brittonum mentions Arthur. It calls him a war leader, dux bellorum in the Latin, not a king, a military commander operating alongside kings who were the actual rulers. It lists 12 battles Arthur is said to have fought. The final battle on the list is the Battle of Badon Hill. Badon Hill, the same battle Gildas described without naming any commander. 300 years separate these two texts. In Gildas, Badon Hill belongs to the generation of Ambrosius Aurelianus. In the Historia Brittonum, it belongs to Arthur. The record does not explain how this transfer happened. It simply records that it did. The Annales Cambriae, the Welsh Annales, are the other early source that names Arthur. The date of their composition is placed at around 960. The entries relevant to Arthur appear within the text as dated entries for the years 516 and 537. The first records a Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights. The second records the Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medraut fell. These dates, 516 and 537, are themselves derived from a chronological framework the Annals constructed retrospectively. They are not contemporary records of events as they happened. They are later entries inserted into a chronological structure. The Annales Cambriae are written in the 10th century and describe events attributed to the 5th and 6th centuries. The gap between composition and event is between 400 and 500 years. The single mention of Arthur in Y Gododin, a Welsh poem attributed to the poet Aneurin and associated with a battle at Chrétien, is earlier in the poem's attributed date. But the date of the poem is itself disputed. The manuscripts in which it survives are medieval. The Arthur reference appears in one passage and not in all manuscript versions. Scholars have debated whether the line is original to the poem or a later interpolation. The manuscript tradition does not settle this question. What the record shows up to this point is this. Gildas, writing closest in time to the events, does not mention Arthur. The Historia Brittonum, written roughly 3 centuries later, introduces Arthur as a war leader and assigns him 12 battles, including Badon Hill. The Annales Cambriae, written roughly 4 centuries after the events, record 2 dated Arthur entries. The dates were constructed retrospectively. Y. Gododin contains 1 Arthur reference of disputed authenticity. These are the primary sources for the historical Arthur. All of them. The question the record raises is not whether Arthur existed. It is why the earliest source, the one closest to the period, does not name him, and what happened in the centuries that followed to produce a figure of such elaboration from so thin a documentary base. The pivot in this case is not a murder. It is not a verdict. It is not a ruling that excluded evidence. The pivot is a book. It was written by a man named Geoffrey of Monmouth. It was completed around the year 1138. Its title is Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. Geoffrey was a cleric. He was associated with Oxford. He dedicated his work to powerful patrons, including Robert of Gloucester and Waleran of Meulan, men whose political interests shaped the world in which Geoffrey was writing. England in 1138 was in the middle of what would become the civil war known as the Anarchy. The question of legitimate kingship was not an academic matter. Geoffrey claims in his preface that he is translating an ancient book. A very ancient book, he says, brought from Brittany by his friend Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. That book, Geoffrey says, set out the history of the British kings in an orderly and beautiful style. No other source mentions this book. It does not survive. No trace of it has been found in any archive. Scholars have debated for centuries whether it existed. The current consensus in medieval studies is that it probably did not. The features of Geoffrey's text that claim to derive from an ancient source are better explained as Geoffrey's own composition. Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britanniae is where Arthur becomes a king. Not a war leader, not a Dux Bellorum, a king, the greatest king Britain ever produced, a conqueror of Europe, a ruler who defeated Rome itself. Geoffrey's Arthur has a court. He has named advisors. He has a sword, called Caliburn in Geoffrey's Latin, a name that later becomes Excalibur. He has a magician, Merlin, whom Geoffrey introduces in an earlier section of the same work, and then brings into Arthur's story at the moment of Arthur's conception. Geoffrey describes Arthur's conception in specific terms. Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father, desires Igerna, the wife of the Duke of Cornwall. Merlin disguises Uther as the Duke. Arthur is conceived in deception. None of this appears in Gildas. None of it appears in the Historia Brittonum. None of it appears in the Annales Cambriae. Geoffrey is not transmitting a tradition. He is building one. Geoffrey's work was enormously successful. It was copied widely. It was translated. It was taken as authoritative by readers who did not have access to the earlier, thinner sources against which it could be checked. Within 17 years of Geoffrey completing his Historia, a Norman poet named Wace produced a French verse adaptation. Wace's work is called the Roman de Brut. It is dedicated to Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of England. Wace introduced something Geoffrey did not include: the Round Table. One sentence. Wace says Arthur made the Round Table so that none of his barons could claim precedence over the others. Every man seated at it was equal. That is the first appearance of the Round Table in any written source. 1155, 600 years after the period in which Arthur is said to have lived. The French romances followed. Chrétien de Troyes was writing in the 1170s and 1180s. He wrote a series of verse romances in Old French that transformed Arthur's court into something recognizable to modern readers. Chrétien introduced Lancelot. He introduced the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. He introduced Camelot. The name appears in a single line of his poem, Lancelot, or the Knight of the Cart, as the place from which the queen departs. Chrétien does not describe it. He names it and moves on. Camelot, 1170s, Old French, a name in a single line. Chrétien also wrote the first surviving version of the Grail story. His Percival, or the Story of the Grail, introduces the wounded Fisher King and the question Percival fails to ask. Chrétien left the poem unfinished. He died before completing it. Others finished it for him. The Grail in Chrétien is not the cup of the Last Supper. That identification came later. The accumulation can be set out precisely. Arthur as a war leader. Historia Brittonum, circa 830. 3 centuries after the period he is said to inhabit. Arthur as a king. Geoffrey of Monmouth, 1138. 6 centuries after. The sword, Caliburn. Later Excalibur. Geoffrey of Monmouth, 1138. Merlin as Arthur's advisor. Geoffrey of Monmouth, 1138. The Round Table. Wace, 1155. Lancelot. Chrétien de Troyes, circa 1177. Camelot as a named location. Chrétien de Troyes, circa 1177. The Grail Quest. Chrétien de Troyes, circa 1180s. The Sword in the Stone. The Prose Lancelot, early 13th century. This is not the same as Excalibur in all versions of the tradition. The sword drawn from the stone and the sword given by the Lady of the Lake are distinct objects in the earlier texts. Later versions collapsed them into one. Guinevere as a substantial character with her own story. The French prose romances of the 13th century. Morgan Le Fay as a developed antagonist. The same tradition. The death at Avalon and the promise of return. Present in Geoffrey, elaborated across the French prose cycle. Each of these elements has a first appearance date. None of them is earlier than 830. Most are 12th or 13th century. The figure who carries all of them simultaneously, the Arthur of modern imagination, is a composite assembled over roughly 4 centuries of literary elaboration. The question the record raises at this point is not complicated. If Arthur was a real historical figure of sufficient importance to be remembered across post-Roman Britain, why does the earliest surviving account of that period not name him? Gildas was writing about the very events in which Arthur is supposed to have been the central figure. Badon Hill, the battle Arthur is said to have won, is in Gildas. The victory is in Gildas. The name of the leader Gildas credits with the recovery is in Gildas. Arthur is not. Several explanations have been proposed by scholars. The first is that Gildas simply chose not to name Arthur for reasons that are not recoverable. Gildas names Ambrosius, but he is selective in his references. Perhaps Arthur was a subordinate figure not worth naming in the context of Gildas's argument. The second is that Arthur was known by a different name or title in Gildas's time, and the name Arthur attached to this figure later. The third is that Arthur is a figure from a tradition Gildas did not have access to or chose not to engage with. The fourth is that the Arthur of the later tradition is not a memory of a single historical figure, but a composite, a name that accumulated stories and attributes that originally belonged to different people in different contexts. The record does not resolve which of these explanations is correct. Scholars have argued for versions of all of them. The argument continues. What the record does establish is that the elaboration of the tradition happened in a specific context. It happened in the courts of Norman and Angevin England and France. It happened for audiences that were Norman French in language and culture. It happened at a time when the question of British kingship and British identity was politically charged. Geoffrey was writing in 1138. England was in civil war. The legitimate succession to the throne was in dispute. A history of a great British king served purposes that were not purely literary. Wace dedicated his adaptation to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was Queen of England. Her husband was Henry II. The Arthurian legend, in the form Wace gave it, became associated with the Plantagenet court. When the monks of Glastonbury announced in 1191 that they had found the graves of Arthur and Guinevere in their abbey grounds, it was during the reign of Richard I. Richard was about to leave on crusade. The discovery established that Arthur was dead and buried, and was not, as Welsh tradition held, sleeping somewhere and waiting to return. The inscription on the cross found with the grave read, according to later accounts, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur, with Guinevere his second wife, in the Isle of Avalon." The cross does not survive. No contemporary account of the excavation describes the discovery in detail. The earliest descriptions of the cross are from decades after the event. This is where the record and the legend most clearly part. The legend says, Arthur is waiting. He will return in Britain's hour of need. He is the once and future king. The record says a cross was found at Glastonbury in 1191, establishing that Arthur was dead. The record does not verify the cross. The cross does not survive. The excavation was not documented at the time. What the record does show is who benefited from each version of the story. The sleeping king who will return belonged to the Welsh. It was a story of resistance and hope. It was politically inconvenient for English rulers. The dead king whose bones were in the ground belonged to Glastonbury, which needed pilgrims and revenue after a fire had destroyed much of the abbey, and to the Plantagenet court, which needed the story closed. The record does not establish that the Glastonbury discovery was fabricated. It establishes that the discovery was convenient, that the evidence for it is late and thin, and that it served identifiable interests. That is the limit of what the record can say. The legend did not stop in the 12th century. It did not stop in the 13th. It was picked up by Malory in the 15th century. Thomas Malory wrote Le Morte d'Arthur while in prison. His sources were the French prose romances. His English prose gave the tradition a new form and a new audience. Malory's Arthur is the Arthur most people who have read anything about the legend have encountered. The knights, the code of chivalry, the tragedy of Camelot's fall, the boat to Avalon. Malory published, or rather Caxton published for him, in 1485, the year Henry VII came to the throne after Bosworth, the first Tudor king, a man of Welsh descent who named his eldest son Arthur. Prince Arthur, born 1486, died 1502 before he could inherit. The Tudors used the Arthurian legend as political currency. It connected them to an ancient British lineage. It gave their rule a mythological depth it would not otherwise have possessed. The Victorian revival took the legend further. Tennyson's Idylls of the King, the pre-Raphaelites, a legend refashioned as a moral and spiritual allegory for a Christian empire. Each generation found in the silence what it needed. This is what the record shows. A 6th century cleric writing in Latin describes a British victory at Badon Hill. He credits Ambrosius Aurelianus. He names no one called Arthur. 3 centuries later, a text of uncertain authorship introduces Arthur as a war leader who fought 12 battles. It gives him Badon Hill. 6 centuries after the events, Geoffrey of Monmouth writes a history that makes Arthur a king, gives him a sword, a magician, and a European empire. 17 years later, Wace adds a round table. 30 years after Wace, Chrétien de Troyes adds Lancelot, Camelot, and the Grail. The prose romances of the 13th century add the sword in the stone, the full story of Guinevere, Morgan Le Fay, and the detailed geography of a kingdom that has no location in the historical record. Malory compiles it, the Tudors use it, the Victorians consecrate it. And at the base of all of it, the ground on which all of it rests, there is a silence. A monk writing in 540, describing exactly the period, exactly the conflict, exactly the victory that Arthur is supposed to have defined, naming a different man. The question this episode asked at the outset was not whether Arthur existed. That question cannot be answered from the record. The record does not contain enough to close it either way. The question was different. It was, how does a silence become a legend? The answer the record suggests is not mysterious. It is structural. A silence is an invitation. When the written record does not name someone, when it does not explain something, when it leaves a space, that space becomes available. It can be filled, and what fills it is shaped by the needs of the people doing the filling. Post-Roman Britain needed a leader who had saved it. The Welsh, under pressure from Norman and English rule, needed a king who would return. The Plantagenets needed a legitimate connection to ancient British sovereignty. The Tudors needed a mythological lineage. The Victorians needed a moral exemplar. The legend of Arthur served all of these needs. It served them so well that the question of what the original record contained became, for most purposes, irrelevant. The need for the legend was more powerful than the need for the record. What this means for how we read the sources is precise. It does not mean Arthur did not exist. The record cannot establish that. It means that the Arthur of the legend, the King, the Round Table, Camelot, Excalibur, Lancelot, the Grail, Avalon, is a literary construction. It was built over centuries by writers working for specific audiences with specific purposes. Each writer added something. Each edition responded to what the audience needed. The construction is not a failure. It is one of the most remarkable pieces of sustained literary elaboration in the European tradition. Across 5 centuries, in multiple languages, in multiple genres, writers took a silence and built a world inside it. That world is not history. It is something the record did not contain, and something people could not do without. Gildas finished his sermon. He had named Ambrosius. He had named Badon Hill. He had not named Arthur. Whether that was because Arthur did not exist, or because Arthur was irrelevant to his argument, or because Arthur was known by another name, or because the figure later called Arthur was a composite of people Gildas had no way to anticipate would be compressed into one. The record does not say. It simply stops. And into that stopping place, across the next 1,000 years, an entire world was built. The name in the record is Ambrosius Aurelianus. The name in the legend is Arthur. The gap between those two names is where the story lives. The record does not close it. The Black Archive examines the distance between what the record contains and what the story became. Every case in this archive begins with the same question. Not what happened, what the record shows happened, and what was built in the space between those two things. If this episode is useful to you, the full case file, with every source cited and every claim traced to its tier, is at the Black Archive on Substack. The link is in the profile. The record closes. The question does not. Thank you for listening. More cases soon from the Black Archive. Until then, goodbye.